Good evening, everyone. My name is Shun Inoue, and I'm with the Japan Foundation in New York's Arts and Culture team. Thank you all very much for tuning into our virtual talk tonight titled Transforming the World, How Japanese Robots Saved the Nation and Charmed the Planet. This talk is co-organized by the Japan Foundation New York and the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens in Delray Beach, Florida. This year, the Japan Foundation launched JFF Plus, a new online Japanese film festival in response to the ongoing worldwide coronavirus pandemic, which is preventing international audiences from experiencing Japanese cinema in theaters. The virtual film festival started yesterday on December 4th and will continue through next Sunday, December 13th. I've included a link to the film festival in the description box to check it out. For tonight's lecture, we have invited two distinguished panelists and a moderator to discuss topics such as the influence of Japanese robots in pop culture, fantasy robot genres featuring autonomous android and drivable robots, and finally, about real-life robots and technology inspired by childhood memories and dreams. Our special guests tonight are Mr. Frederik Schodt, writer of numerous books on popular culture, technology, and history. He is a translator of robot-related mangas such as Astro Boy, Ghost in the Shell, Pluto, and the Mobile Suit Gundam novels, and has won numerous awards for his works with translation and interpretation. He is also the recipient of the Japan Foundation Award in 2017. Our next panelist is Mr. Matt Alt, co-founder of AltJapan, a Tokyo-based entertainment localization company. He has over 20 years' experience working with the content creators of games, manga, and his writing has appeared widely in print and online at The New Yorker, Slate, Wired, BBC, just to name a few. Our moderator tonight is Professor Chris Smith, and he teaches modern Japanese literature and popular culture at the University of Florida. We really appreciate our guests for joining us this evening. We will begin our program tonight by watching the panelists discuss the influence of Japanese robots in popular culture through a pre-recorded video. After their discussion, we will open up the floor for a live Q&A session moderated by Professor Smith. We hope that this discussion will interest you in watching Project Dreams, How to Build Mazinger Z's Hangar, one of the films from the lineup tomorrow. While this film does not delve deeply into the world of making robots per se, it does address one of the main themes of the talk: how childhood dreams and memories inspire the eventual creation of real-life technology. Now, without further ado, I'd like to start the presentation, and we will see you back here again for the Q&A session shortly. Please enjoy.
Thank you for that fabulous introduction, and I just want to say it's a real honor to be able to talk here today and to be invited by the Morikami and also by the Japan Foundation, and also to be able to talk with my old friend in Japan, Matt Alt, who's a great person to talk with about this subject with. I just wanted to say start out and mention something about the film that I think will be streamed. I found it just hilarious. It's just crazy, wacky, and I was surprised because, of course, it's less about Mazinger Z and building robots than it is, I think, just a wonderful satire on Japanese corporate culture. And I think Matt will probably add his opinion on that too. But in the background, this film, because of its structure, it really requires something from Japanese popular culture that everybody knows is sort of an iconic figure, and that's Mazinger Z. So even though he doesn't appear that directly, he's the linchpin that makes this all work. And so in effect, a talk on Japanese fantasy robots is very appropriate, I think. That's my segue into my own introduction. I first arrived in Japan in 1965 when I was 15. And I lived there off and on for a long time, and I still go back regularly. But when I arrived, obviously Japan was very different than it is today. But robot characters were already really beloved by children. And in manga, starting in the early 1950s, there were two characters, namely Mighty Atom, or Tetsuan Atom, who's known in the United States as Astro Boy. It was all very popular, and then there was another character by Yokoyama Mitsuteru called Tetsujin 28, or Iron Man 28, and in America known as Gigantor. And these were just beloved by children in Japan as manga, as comics. And then just 2 years before I arrived, I think in 1963, what we know of as Astro Boy was animated. And shortly after that, Iron Man 28 or Gigantor was also animated. And this was the beginning of what you can think of today as this giant pop culture machine that's emerged in Japan and has gone on and developed. And because of these two animated series, they paved the way for what has become this pattern today, which is the manga are sort of the wellspring for a lot of the imagination that goes into these shows and characters. And then they're turned into animation, and then they're turned into toys, and then they're turned into games, and then they're turned into operas, and you name it, novels, and on and on and on. And then there might even be a sequel. So in effect, Japan was able to create in 1963 the framework for what today is this giant pop culture machine, which has colonized the minds of young people around the world, much in the way that American pop culture did before Japan. So I just wanted to say that actually getting ready for this talk made me think about my own involvement with robots in Japan. And in the introduction, there was also already, I think, a list of some of the things I've worked on. But the thing that struck me was actually how much of my life I've spent writing about robots, even though I've tried to write about other things. You know, I write about international relations. I write about, industrial robots. And, it always comes, I always have to put something in about robots. And I wasn't so aware of that until today. This was my first book, 1983, The World of Japanese Comics. And on the back, there's actually, it has all these iconic characters from Japanese manga at the time, and many of them from animation. So everybody knows this. And on the back here, you can probably see, this is an image of Mazinger Z from the manga, from the original manga. And after that book, I got seriously interested in real robots, and I wrote a book on the cultural aspects of technology in Japan, and I use the robot in all aspects, so industrial robots and manga and toys and animation, as sort of a metaphor to talk about how people related to technology. I don't know if it's a little hard to see, but there's a very early robot with visual recognition capability. And of course in it, there's quite a bit of stuff on Mazinger Z and other robots as well. Then I wrote a book about international relations, and of course I had to write a little bit about robots. And then I wrote a book on Astro Boy and Tezuka and the whole manga anime thing. And then next week, or 2 weeks from now, I guess I have a new book coming out on a Buddhist sutra, the Heart Sutra. And of course I had to put in something on robots, and I'll talk about that later. So there's the robots always creep in, is what I'm saying. Anyway, moving forward, I wanted to show some images of Go Nagai, who is the creator of Mazinger. Here we go. Let's see if this works. Here he is. Go Nagai was sort of the bête noire, or the bad boy of Japanese manga towards the end of the 60s and the early 70s. He wrote series about with an erotic component in Japanese schoolrooms and things like that. And he did these quite violent and quite gory and quite occult series. They're all wonderful series. But in 1972, he started drawing Mazinger Z. And this is when I interviewed him in 1981. Actually, this is a long time ago. Here he is. And he's drawing another work that he was working on at the time. He was already very successful. He was an example of an artist that, to me, because I know a lot of manga artists, and often they're quite oppressed, they work too hard and whatnot. But Go Nagai was, he seemed very shy and soft-spoken, but he really had a handle on things, I think, how to carry out what he was trying to do. So he had a company already with over 50 people. And it was very much a family operation called Dynamic Productions. And he had 13 assistants, so he had already adopted the Japanese mass production system for drawing cartoons, or not cartoons, I should say manga or comic books. And when Mazinger was shortly thereafter turned into a weekly animation series, it was hugely popular. And let's see, how do I do this? There we go. That's Mazinger Z in all its glory. This was in my book, Manga. So this was drawn by Go Nagai. It's a giant robot, and it became sort of heralded the real prominence of these giant warrior robots, fantasy robots in manga, and also especially in animation, and then in toys, as Matt will mention even more of. So Go Nagai was quite a star, and he was very young. He had started working as an artist. I think he was probably only 27, something like that. When he did Mazinger Z, well, he's 5 years older than me, so he still would have been very young, maybe in his, he would have been probably 34 or something like that. But here he is with these luminaries of the Japanese manga world. This is Ishinomori Shotaro, who's passed away, and Tezuka Osamu is in the background. This is Go Nagai and his lovely wife, Sumiko, both of whom have become friends of mine. And this is Monkey Punch, who unfortunately passed away this year, and his wife, and Takao Saito, who's the creator of Go-Go 13, about assassins, around an assassin who goes around the world and has adventures. These people were all very successful, and in a way they were quite wealthy, because Go Nagai, for example, even in 1981, when I interviewed him, his manager told me that he had sold over $5 million worth of manga and books in Europe, because Go Nagai's Mazinger Z and other works were some of the first Japanese comics to be localized overseas. So he was kind of a star, and you can see it here. But he was always very humble and very sweet. Here he is. This is recent. This is just a couple of years ago. And I think he's aged better than almost all the Japanese manga artists I know. He's got some kind of secret up his sleeve. I don't know what it is. And here he is at another, I usually see him every year at the International Manga Award that's run by the Japan Foundation and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. And I've been on the executive committee, and I think that Go Nagai was also on this for a while. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, this year I went and saw him, but this 2021, it probably won't happen. So that's pretty much my segue. And I'll turn it over to Matt. I think I'm on time almost. Yes, I'm on time. Matt, you're on. And I'll stop my screen here.
Well, thank you very much for that really wonderful look into your relationship with Go Nagai. He's a seminal sort of presence in my life as well. I was born in 1973, and I came of age in the United States in a sort of renaissance for imported Japanese pop culture, most of it, in fact, in the form of toy robots. And so, for me personally, my encounters with these robot toys really sort of inflected the direction of my life. They sparked a lifelong interest for me in things Japanese. And as you can see from the lair that I am broadcasting this from in Tokyo right now, robot toys still play a very important role in my life. So when I watched the movie Dream Project, it at first might seem to some that the use of a giant robot character as a pivotal sort of key point in this satire of Japanese office life might seem very frivolous. But in fact, I think it's very prescient, because the ability that not only robots in general, but toys in specific have to sort of change our lives is very real, because toys are little pieces of culture that we can hold in our hands even from a very young age. And they're kind of windows into the imagination of another country. And as I said, when I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s in the United States, this sort of trickle of products from Japan, starting actually with robot characters made by Go Nagai, whose Mazinger Z stars in the Dream Project movie, starting with his characters, started to be imported into the American marketplace. At first, they were just imported as toys. There was a series called the Shogun Warriors that I grew up with as a kid that represented, they were sold in America as toys, but they were actually character merchandise. They were merchandise for anime shows in Japan. And we didn't get those anime shows in the States at first. There wasn't a very strong connection between the products and the shows, because in America of the 1970s in particular, there were rules against broadcasting content aimed at kids that also contained portrayals of merchandise that was on the shelves. This was actually, if not outright banned, very frowned upon by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, who called it host pitching. And it had been the subject of several lawsuits in the United States aimed at protecting the hearts and minds of young Americans from corporations who might use entertainment to merchandise products to them. Well, this all started to change around 1977 with the appearance of a film you might have heard of called Star Wars. And famously, Star Wars' director, George Lucas, made much more money off of selling action figures and play sets from Star Wars than he did from the actual film itself. It turned out that the merchandising rights for that were a huge cash cow, which is something that nobody had ever expected before. And the television, the toy companies who didn't have similar movies to Star Wars to sell their products got very incensed about this and began lobbying the American government. At first kind of fruitlessly, but then after Ronald Reagan took power and became president, started to find a lot of traction. And Reagan was very deregulationist. Reagan was very interested in allowing the kind of market to regulate itself. And one of the first deregulations he performed was of the FCC, who immediately struck all the laws off the books regulating what companies could or couldn't broadcast toward children. And that ushered in this new era where you could put on cartoons on Saturday morning or whatever that were also serving in the service of selling products. The only problem was that for a decade or more, Americans hadn't had this ability and didn't have any content ready to go for when the law changed. So what happened was Americans began to depend very heavily on Japanese content producers to make cartoons that they could use to sell toys. And because in Japan, there had been already for decades a very well-developed media mix, as the Japanese call it, in which Japanese animation companies and Japanese advertising companies and television stations and toy producers work in a kind of consortium together to produce content that markets toys to children. We basically imported whole cloth, this Japanese style of storytelling and merchandising to appeal to children. And this unleashed a flood of Japanized and Japanese robot content onto American airwaves. By the time I was a preteen, we had shows like the Transformers, Robotech, Voltron, and even shows that were supposedly American, like G.I. Joe, a real American hero, were being animated in Japan, often by the same companies who were animating shows like Mazinger Z and other Japanese robot fare. So in a very real way, in the 1980s, as American politicians fretted about the Japanese corporations taking over the American marketplace, by deregulating the American airwaves, they handed over the keys to an even more precious commodity, which was the hearts and minds of American children, who became, like myself, very much obsessed with this new wave of totally unique content that was unlike anything that we had seen before. Take the Transformers, for example. A very successful franchise that continues in various forms to this day. As I'm sure many of you are aware, it's a series of really intricate little gadgets, I guess you could say, of toys that transform from various vehicles into robots. In Japan, these were just sold as kind of puzzles towards kids, but an American company called Hasbro took them up and added its own American storyline to them. And that's how the Transformers were created, which is one of the big toy booms of the 1980s. And the Transformers was really interesting because it was this kind of fusion of the American sensibilities of the storytelling with the Japanese, the intricacy of the Japanese toy making. And as we'll be talking about a little bit later in this, Japan has a very long history of making toys. Actually, some of the very first people to go to Japan after its ports opened in the 19th century were shocked at the number of toy stores that they saw operating not only in Japanese cities, but even in small towns and villages. So there's this long history of making playthings that kind of intersected with Japan's post-war rise and the rise of Japanese industry to create almost unthinkably complex toys and playthings and robots in particular that really went beyond the borders of Japan in a way that even their creators didn't anticipate, and laid the groundwork for an entire new form of entertainment that would be taken up by young people, not just in America, but Europe, where Japanese robot anime and Japanese robot toys were extremely popular, especially in places like France and Italy, but all over the world. So in a very real way, this idea that the fantasy character of Mazinger Z could reverse the fortunes of a flagging company isn't fiction at all, because Japanese robots almost single-handedly flipped the image of Japan from what it had been in the 1940s as this enemy of the West to the 1970s and 80s when it was this kind of feared rival of the West, to people in my generation, Generation X and beyond, where Japan is not seen as an enemy. Japan is not seen as a rival. It's seen as this kind of forge of fantasies and dreams, the place that makes all of the cool stuff that we want to own and interact with. And through interacting with those things, our own sensibilities of Westerners have really subtly Japanized, to the point where we can appreciate things like giant robots, or we can appreciate things like, ninja and all sorts of other characters that come out of Japan in ways that previous generations couldn't. And I think, Go Nagai and his robots and all of these toys played just a really key role in doing that, not just for me, but for people all over the world. So I'm not sure if I've gone over or under on I can keep talking about this topic literally for hours, but
you have 2 more minutes, Matt. 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Great. Well, let's talk about all the cool toys that I have. I a little bit about myself. As I said earlier, I was my first encounters with Japanese robots really kind of stoked this interest in Japan. And I was fortunate to have in Maryland, where I was going to high school, my public high school had the first Japanese language program offered at a university, at a high school in the United States. And I was able to use that as a springboard to study the language at college, at university. And now I live in Tokyo. I've lived here for the last 20 years, where with my wife, Hiroko Yoda, and frequent collaborator on various books and projects, we run a localization company that produces the English language versions of all sorts of entertainment, mainly video games, but also a lot of, we work hand in hand with toy companies, with animation studios, all sorts of companies in Japan. And that has given us kind of this seat at the table with a lot of Japanese creators, and this kind of window into a place that a lot of outsiders, even in Japan, don't get to see, this kind of beating heart of Japan's pop cultural machine. And that is precisely what has given me the interest and the kind of focus to be able to work on books like Pure Invention, where I talk at length about how not only Japanese robots, but consumer products of all kinds have really transformed the sensibilities of people around the world and brought all of us into a more Japanese way of not only, consuming, but also very much in living. And Mazinger Z, it might seem like an exaggeration, is very much a part of how all of that changed, because he certainly changed my life.
And I have to say, it's a great book. If you haven't read it yet,
Thank you.
get a copy. And
Well, you know, you were an inspiration, really. Reading manga in high school as a kid, I was, you know, it was very interesting to see somebody who had connected all of the dots of these kind of various series I'd only heard about.
We obviously have a sort of parallel interests in some ways. I have to apologize because the sun's going down here, and every once in a while it seems like my screen has a flock of like locusts or something flying up there, so I have to increase the amount of light. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit next about, if I can get this to work, share my screen. Here we go. This should work. So I showed this image before. This is the sort of quintessential Mazinger Z pose, and he has this aspect of something between an insect-like, medieval knight-like look. And let's see, why is it not moving here? There we go. I wanted to read a little bit from my book on robots that I wrote in 1987, because I did some interviews with Go Nagai at that time, which I think are kind of relevant and interesting. But I'll just skip over a little bit of it. But he said that he actually began developing Mazinger Z way back in 1969. Because the comic really didn't start until 1972, and the animation also didn't start until 1972. But he said all the robot comics were either like Atom or Astro Boy. They were humanoid, or they were like Iron Man number 28, remote controlled. I wanted to create something different, and I thought it would be interesting to have a robot that you could drive like a car. And this image, I think, illustrates that, because you see Koji Kabuto, and he's actually docked into the robot, into the head of the robot, in what's kind of a hovercraft kind of thing. And the artist, or Go Nagai in this case, has envisioned, he's drawn Koji Kabuto. He looks like he's outside the robot, but of course, to the readers who are familiar with manga, they know perfectly well that he's in this cockpit in the head of Mazinger Z. And this was really created a revolution in Japan, I think. And so he went on, when I talked to him, he said, like many other robot works, the plot revolved around fights. In this case, between Mazinger Z and an assortment of monsters and evil robots, usually created by an arch enemy named Dr. Hell. But the robot man symbiosis that Mazinger Z symbolized helped solve an old problem in robot fiction, the problem of personifying the machine while preserving its mechanical identity. When the robot became like a car, a machine that could be jumped in and driven, it had a powerful appeal to young boys. When animated and when toy companies began issuing faithful reproductions, the Mazinger Z series became a smash hit. So Go said, Mazinger Z comes from the Japanese word majin, or genie. The basic concept was of a machine that can be used for either good or evil, that when human will is transferred to it, becomes even more powerful than a human. Go admitted that as a child, he liked the scenes of Tezuka's series where Astro Boy or Atom destroyed the evil big robots. And he says, Atom basically follows Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. But Mazinger Z inherited Atom's destructive power. He is basically a type of tank. This was hugely popular. So Mazinger Z's shape was also a trendsetter. Atom had simply been a little boy, and Iron Man number 28 was a clunky metal giant distinguished mainly by his Neo-European knight's helmet. Mazinger Z also incorporated a knight's visor, but was very brightly colored and had wing and horn-like protrusions on his helmet. The latter evoked some very Japanese images of samurai and insects that have become a trademark of the genre. Most Japanese artists, including Nagai, incorporate these images unconsciously. For young boys in Japan, samurai and samurai armor images have always had a romantic air about them, and so have insects. Traditionally, beetles, cicadas, and fireflies have been caught, kept in cages, and played with by young boys, with horned armored beetles especially prized for their strength. Nagai went on to create innumerable robot stories, most of which were animated for television, and he made one other major contribution to the warrior robot genre in 1974. The toy companies, he recalls, said they needed more characters in each story so they could sell more toys. So I complied by creating a series called Geta Robot, where one hero robot disassembled into 3 smaller robots. This was the start of combining robots. And then, of course, other artists helped pioneer the idea of transformation and so forth and so on. But you can see, I think, from some of the things he said in this interview that I did with him, that he really sort of changed the direction of giant warrior fantasy robots and also robot toys in general, really opening up a new world for toy manufacturers to indulge themselves in. And I know Matt can comment even more on that. But I've always found this aspect of the robot particularly interesting. And actually, I can hand it over to you, Matt.
That's a really good a moment to hand off. I'm going to share my screen for a second here. I think I have to disrupt your screen sharing to share mine.
I'm giving you the screen, yeah.
Okay, I have the comm. So what we're looking at here now is the very first Mazinger Z toy from 1974. And Fred was literally just talking about this a moment ago, because Mazinger Z as a TV series was a revolution, in storytelling, but it was also a revolution in merchandising. And this toy was produced by a Japanese company called Popey, and it was a huge, huge, huge hit. They released it to coincide with the TV series, and it was marketed as being made from chogokin, a Japanese word meaning super alloy. That is a fictional material that's indestructible, and was said, it was actually what Mazinger Z was said to be made of in the animated series. So the idea that kids could own, in their minds, a literal piece of Mazinger Z proved incredibly, incredibly intoxicating. Even to me, Mazinger Z wasn't broadcast in the United States until almost 10 years after it was broadcast in Japan. In the West, it was broadcast under the name Transor Z, and it came out in the early 80s in that robot boom I was talking about. And we didn't have anywhere near the amount of associated products that the Japanese did, but it was a huge, mind-blowing idea for us, even as Americans, to imagine that we might be piloting this giant robot, that we might be getting into the heads of it. As speaking for myself, I'd loved robots ever since I was a little kid, but they were mainly things like C-3PO and R2-D2, or, like maybe the Terminator, if you're talking about a scary robot. The idea that you could get into a robot and kind of fuse with it was something that we didn't really have any equivalent of that in the United States, and was one of the reasons why Mazinger Z, and I think Transor Z as it was known in English, so enchanted us as kids. But this toy, this Chogokin Mazinger Z, turned out to be a huge hit, to the point where Japanese toy companies began realizing that it probably made more sense, instead of waiting for a manga artist to come along with another hit, to actually start to commission robot toys, robot shows, by making the robot toy first and showing it to an animation studio and saying, make a show out of this. And one of the first examples of that was a series called Brave Raideen, which came out very shortly after Mazinger Z. It was originated by a toy company who came up with this design, which actually is one of the, if not the first transforming design. You have this giant robot with a vaguely Egyptian sort of pharaoh-looking motif, which was something very popular in all sorts of pop culture at the time in 1970s, all over the world. And it could transform into this god bird, as it's known in the series, this kind of flight mode. And this is really interesting because it very much builds on what Go Nagai had been doing with Mazinger Z, but it was conceived as merchandise from the start. And now you might think that kids would see through this, or think that this is some kind of, cheap appeal to their sensibilities. But in fact, they ate it up. They loved it, and it turned out that this was an entire new way of making content. And for the remainder of the 70s and lasting well into the 1980s, you basically didn't have an animated show unless there was a giant robot in it. And that giant robot was inevitably designed in a toy company. And this fostered this sort of arms race between Japanese toy companies, among Japanese toy companies, who would compete with one another for the mind share of Japanese kids with new gimmicks and increasingly complicated features. Because, to stand out in a very crowded toy marketplace, a marketplace that was already vibrant even before the arrival of Japanese toys, you really had to come up with all sorts of new things to appeal to kids. And before long, as kids who had been raised on this content ever since they were kids, maybe they had, been really little when Astro Boy came out in the 60s, and then they were kind of preteens or teenagers when Mazinger Z came out. By the time they were young adults, they had absorbed so much of this content that they didn't want to give it up. And that led to the foundation of a series called Mobile Suit Gundam in 1977. Gundam is a hugely popular series in Japan. It stars, it centers on the idea of this giant robot that once again is piloted by a young man in kind of a glorious, epic space operatic battle. Look at that, Fred has one. We're gonna have to cut back to Fred later about this. But Mobile Suit Gundam was interesting because it was commissioned by a toy company. But the toy company gave a great amount of leeway to the gentleman who actually came up with the story, a guy named Yoshiyuki Tomino. And Tomino made a series that was so steeped in anti-war and social criticism that it's hard to imagine that this was originally conceived as a kid's show. And in fact, it did flop as a kid's show. But what ended up happening was similar to how in the United States, when Star Trek went off the air, there was kind of a letter writing campaign to bring it back on. In the pages of anime magazines, young adults began this sort of campaign to bring Gundam back. And that succeeded in the early 80s when a theatrical version of the film was released. And Mobile Suit Gundam became more than a cartoon show for a generation of young Japanese. It became a sort of identity. They identified with the protagonist of Gundam, who was no longer this superhero, but this kind of kid who was forced to fight in a war that he didn't want to fight in a robot that he didn't really have any affection for, but just happened to be unnaturally skilled at using, and who was a pacifist who was forced to kill people over and over again, kind of establishing this sort of dark theme of young people being, used by the adults in the world around them that you can see in all sorts of manga and anime to come, this sort of adolescent angst. So Mazinger Z was a sort of beginning. Gundam was a sort of transformation into where animation became something more than a medium for kids. It became something that was consumed by young adults, and it became something that was not only just a product, but an identity of sorts, which prefigures the way that anime is consumed now by people all over the world. When you see at anime conventions, people cosplaying and people who literally identify with these characters in such a way that anime and manga and giant robot heroes and all sorts of fantasy content from Japan has literally become a form of identity abroad. And that, again, is something that I do not think would have happened without Go Nagai's work and without Mazinger Z as a character and the popularity of all of that. And it's a reason why now giant robots, we see them appearing in all sorts of Western fare, things from the Matrix movies where the climax involves the heroes using giant robots to fight off hordes of computer controlled enemies, or Pacific Rim most recently, which Guillermo del Toro, a Spaniard, is making this sort of parody and homage of Japanese robot movies. He's not even Japanese. There's only one Japanese person starring in the film. Everybody else is American or Australian or Chinese. And I think that really just goes to show you how deeply the concept of human piloted giant robots resonates with people all over the world and has kind of transformed our fantasies. So, it's Fred, what was your robot that you were holding up there? I was hogging the screen there. I want to see what you have here.
My Gundam robot, which I bought a long time ago.
Oh, wow. That's a classic.
Yeah, it's a classic, and it requires so many moves to make it transform
Yes.
that I've forgotten all the moves. So it just collects dust on top of my
So
refrigerator.
that's Zeta Gundam. That's the
Yeah,
sequel
that's
to
Zeta
the
Gundam.
Gundam. Well, here I
Yeah.
can one up you. I can one up you because I have double Zeta Gundam here. This is the sequel to that. So Gundam. Whoops! Well, there goes his backpack. The Gundam is interesting because it has just continued in so many different sequels and forms over the years. It's become kind of a it started out as this
Yeah,
series and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
become this franchise.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Very much in the vein of how, for instance, Star Wars has spun off all of these games and all of these
Yeah,
TV shows and stuff. And it's
yeah,
interesting, when I first came to Japan, actually, one of the ways that I would connect with people was talking about Gundam because it was a
yeah.
touchstone that literally everybody in my generation knew.
Yeah, and
And
when you mention that, it's interesting because I was at Anime North, well, pre-pandemic, I guess a year and a half ago, and they had this huge competition. It was a Gunpla, a
right,
Gundam
yes, Gundam
plastic
models.
model. And
Yes,
I was
yes.
amazed because in North America now, this was in Canada, but in the United States and North America now, there's this huge thing of Gundam models. And of course, the people competing in this are, they're not really kids, they're adults, which is amazing.
Yes, yes.
And I was going to say that, I know Tomino fairly well, who created the original Gundam trilogy, but also he wrote the novel,
Yes.
which is here, and I worked on this forever. But it's really dark, like you say, and it's Tomino was kind of obsessed. I think he wanted young Japanese who had been so sheltered from war because of the peace constitution and having lived in peace for nearly 50 years, that he wanted to tell them, how bleak war is. So the novel is even bleaker than the animated series. And of course, the main protagonist dies, which is kind of, a lot of people don't know that, but in the novel he dies. In the series, he continues on.
Well,
And
in the West, we had that whole reaction to superhero comics that came out in the '80s with all of this dark, gritty reboots of characters like Batman or the
yeah,
Watchmen or things like that. And I think Gundam is a sort of dark, gritty reboot of Mazinger Z. It's
yeah,
the kind of
yeah,
dark. What if
yeah,
you're a giant robot pilot? It's not all like unicorns and laser
yeah,
blasts. It's
yeah,
there's a dark side to being a giant robot pilot too. So that's a kind of
yeah.
unique thing about that.
So I guess that's 10 minutes for you, and then I will shift gears a little bit. I think talk about dark clouds. My screen is collapsing here, so I'm going to get rid of my virtual background, and it'll be Bye Bye San Francisco, and we'll be truly looking at a green screen here.
This is like an anime that you've wiped out
That's
San
right. That's
Francisco.
right. Yeah.
It's like an epic
That's
apocalyptic
San
anime
Francisco,
show.
right?
There it goes.
Looks like the locust plague or something. Um, but let me share my screen again here. And I wanted to just touch on sort of how robots, just broaden it a little bit and talk a little bit about how robots have become such an integral part of not only entertainment in Japan, but something that people are so familiar with. And the interesting thing is, like Matt, you were mentioning, because now I think, a lot of these Japanese concepts, or what were originally Japanese concepts, they're not Japanese anymore. They've been exported so successfully to American kids. They don't have this association that might have occurred in the very beginning of people thinking, well, what's that weird kind of insect look like? Why are they doing this and doing it? It's kind of like sushi, you know what I mean? Sushi was,
Yeah.
the FDA didn't recommend eating sushi in the United States until we were recommending against it until I think like 1980 or something. And now a lot of people,
Wow.
I'm not even sure if they're aware, a lot of young people are aware in the States that sushi are from Japan at all. But anyway, I just wanted to touch on the sort of the broader level of robots in Japanese society, and that's one thing that really kind of propelled me to write my book about robots in general, including industrial robots. This one that I touched on earlier. Unfortunately, now, well, in the 80s, there was, of course, a huge industrial robot boom in Japan because the manufacturing industry was just going great guns. And in the media, Japan was often labeled the robot kingdom, robot okoku. And it kind of merged this sense of pride in Japan's deployment of industrial robots, kind of merged, I think, with just the love of robot characters and things like Mazinger Z and Doraemon, cute robots and transforming robots and robots for boys and robots for young boys, like Doraemon. But now, of course, manufacturing is kind of taken a hit in Japan, and a lot of the manufacturing has actually moved offshore. So I don't think Japan is #1 in terms of installed robots, but nonetheless, one big difference between Japan and the United States is you go to a robot show in Japan and you'll see a lot of adults with their children. In the United States, you never see that. People don't take their kids to see industrial robot shows at all. You almost never see kids in the hall, and usually you don't see very many women either. It's mainly people who are in the business, and it's a very practical view of the machines. In Japan and robot shows, there's always some fun thing going on that sort of straddles the line between industrial robots and toy robots, which is hard to believe, but it is possible. And I think also, just in the way, robots have sort of melded into the Japanese mind over the years, you can find things that, again, you still wouldn't find in Europe or the United States. On the left is a bicycle. This is from the 80s, but
Is that your bike, Fred?
Oh, I wish it was mine. Yeah, you should have it in your collection, man.
I wish. I want that helmet.
It's really creative, but it's also interesting because this is what's known in America as Gigantor, or Tetsuji Nijo Hachigo, Iron Man 28 in Japan. But it's really clever the way they have designed the bicycle so that it has this helmet on the handlebars, and then it has on the basket, it has the image of Gigantor and the boy who remotely operates him. But this is such an early robot character from Japanese manga and later anime that he wasn't drivable at all. But nonetheless, the bicycle designer has created a situation where you can feel like you're driving a Gigantor.
It's like modern art.
Yeah, and one thing a lot of people probably don't realize is the scale of these things. You can see from this image that obviously Gigantor was pretty big. That's why he's called Gigantor in the United States. But some of the robots, the fantasy warrior robots in Japan, are enormous. And Matt, you probably have more information on this than I do. But I believe that like Vanguard Ace was like nearly 200 meters tall.
Oh yeah, that's part of the arms race. You had to make your show had to have the bigger robot. Yeah, some of them are absolutely absurdly huge.
And on the right-hand side, there's a little boy driving a robot on top of a department store, the sort of thing that you often see in Japan. Here he's driving a robot. I can't tell, Matt, you have better eyes than I do here, but I always thought this was a Gundam robot, but it's not strictly speaking a Gundam robot.
It's a generic Gundam-esque. It looks kind of like the GM, the generic version of Gundam, but it's an original character, so they didn't have to pay for licensing.
Right.
Something we saw a lot of in the 70s as well.
And also the head looks a little bit, it reminds me a little bit of Gigantor for some reason.
Yeah, it's kind of rounded like that. This Gigantor bike that you're looking at is actually from the 1980s attempted revival of the 1960s series.
Yeah.
So it has a little bit more of a Mazinger style design to it. The original Tetsujin 28 Gigantor was kind of pot-bellied and very stout. And this is a more svelte, he's like on a diet, pumping some iron.
Oh yeah, that's a good version. Point. Yeah.
Yes.
But I just love the way that in Japan that children not only can imagine themselves driving these giant robots, but the manufacturers, not just of toys, but amusement park rides and also bicycles and you name it, have catered to this fantasy as well.
Well, do you think? I think in Japan there's really this sense that it isn't looked down on even for adults to appreciate things like robot toys or these little transforming things. Like you can appreciate them on their own merits. There's a kind of respect for play that I don't think we had in the West for a long time.
Well, I think maybe we face too many serious problems in the West. I don't know, but this is another slide I thought it just really shows how toy robots and the whole transforming robots is totally sunk into Japanese minds. And I've never seen this in the United States. Maybe it's been adapted, but this is transforming a bowl of noodles, of instant noodles. And you can see if you follow the arrows, which I very carefully constructed here. That it's very small actually, and it folds up to, it looks just like the bowl of noodles that you would buy and you would eat, at home when you don't have enough money and you're a college student and you're about to get berry because nothing that you eat nothing but instant noodles. And you can see one leg comes out, then another leg comes out, and it's like a puzzle.
It is.
Sort of like the Gundam transforming toys. But in this case, it's transforming a bowl of noodles, and it's a seaweed menkoku, so it's got seaweed flavoring in it. And of course, in the very end, then there's a little seaweed sword, a wakame seaweed sword that he's holding, which is also
Of course
really cool.
He does.
And this is on the top of my refrigerator, and I still have it. It's collected a lot of dust, but it's great. This is also from the 80s when I was around the time I had written my book on Inside the Robot Kingdom. And I thought this was really interesting because this is very clearly Tetsujin 28, or what we know in the United States is Iron Man 2028 or Gigantor. And this is in a subway station, and it's a labor union. It's the Keisei Dokumi, or so the Keisei labor union, and they've put this up to support themselves in their movement against what in Japan would be called the rationalization of the labor force, or in other words, layoffs, that sort of thing. They use this word rationalization a lot in Japan in the labor movement, but it says, I too am opposed to rationalization, and they've used this image of Iron Man 28, and I just thought, well, that's really amazing. Here are labor union guys out on the streets marching and whatnot, and then in the subway they've posted up this hand-drawn image of Gigantor. So there's a lot of things like that that always fascinate me. Recently in Japan, I'm sure Matt has seen so many of these. He's sick of them already.
Pepper.
Yeah, Pepper. Pepper is manufactured, I believe it actually is designed in France, but it's SoftBank, which operates this. I don't know if they have a franchise system where you actually have to buy these, but they're
I think they're renting them now is how it works. You can rent them for your company.
Yeah, so they're in a lot of stores, and they're part of a genre of robots in Japan that sort of straddle the line between useful robots and robots that are, manga, anime, just entertainment. They're used as welcoming devices, and they can answer a certain limited number of questions and respond to you and, shake your hand and that kind of thing. It's kind of a gimmick, but you see a lot of these things in Japan. This is an old slide. It's from several years ago. And there's a newer version of Gundam now. And Matt, did you go see it recently?
So yeah, this is what you have a picture of here is the life-size Gundam statue, which I think opened in 2014, and it made a lot of headlines because something like 4 million people came to visit it in the month after it was first put on display. And it's a life-size Gundam, but this month or next month, I believe in sometime in mid-December, they have now created an actual walking, posing, working life-sized Gundam.
Oh,
and
that's totally cool.
And it's going to walk out of its hangar in Yokohama in December. Man. Yeah, I'm sure they're going to broadcast it everywhere. It's like it seems like a very Japanese response to the coronavirus situation to build a giant robot and launch it. We all needed a little escape. So
well, I would love to see it. Unfortunately, I think Americans are the last people that Japanese immigration wants to let into Japan right now because of the pandemic.
Tough. Yeah, it's tough.
Maybe you could go see it soon and send a photo.
I'll see it for everybody.
Because I love this one. That was a lot of fun. And
it's beautiful.
I think there was some steam or something that came out of this, and lights
it
flash.
Turns its head,
I
think. The head rotates, I think.
Yeah. But after all the work I spent on the Gundam novels, I just thought, wow, this is just so cool. And I actually understand that I don't know if it's still there, but there's a giant statue of Tetsujin 28, the Gigantor, in a park somewhere in Tokyo, which I haven't seen.
No, it's in Kobe. It's where Yokoyama Mitsuteru's hometown.
Yeah, and I really want to see that. And that's
Yeah.
enormous, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's been, well, he's smaller than Gundam, I think, just,
Oh,
in
really?
even in the fictional world, but he's still enormous. I mean, big enough to
Yeah.
step on you.
Yeah.
But it's really cool, yeah.
Yeah.
I love that Japan actually makes these like life size. That there's a need for these life size statues because there's many of them. There's also a life sized Evangelion. There's a life sized. Somebody built a life sized Scope Dog from the series Votoms, and these characters are all over Japan.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. We
Yeah.
need more things like this in the United States.
Yes.
Um, of course, there's also Japan is unique in the sense that I think it's very rare, except for Boston Dynamics mainly. It's very rare for corporations in the United States or Europe to actively pursue the idea of creating humanoid robots. But in Japan, there have been a surprising number of companies who've tried to do this. And Honda has always been at least in the lead in terms of public display of these things, because Asimo, which is created by Honda, I think it was shown in Disneyland actually in LA for a long time, but I don't think it's there now. But every year it gets smaller and it gets better, and it's very agile. It can jump around, it can hop, it can go upstairs and stuff like that. And Honda has put an enormous amount of energy and money into this sort of thing. It's something that American corporations generally do not do because there's no profit involved in it. It's really a publicity effort more than anything else. Um, but again, this is a really interesting example because a lot of the researchers, the early researchers in Japan who were involved in walking robots and creating sort of android-like robots were actually influenced by uh, the shows that they had seen as a kid or the manga that they had read as a kid. And see if I can find my glasses here. So it's getting dark in San Francisco. But anyway, I interviewed some of the researchers, and it was interesting. They said, we are the mighty atom generation, and we were brought up looking at atom in comics and animation. So it just seemed that it would be natural for us to try and create something like that that can walk. So you have a bunch of researchers, actually, the younger researchers at the time, who were partly driven by this love of robots and this love of what they'd seen and grown up with in manga and animation. Now I think that's changed a little bit. They're probably not reflecting on. They're not necessarily pursuing the idea of recreating Astro Boy, which obviously Asimo is in the tradition of. But I've heard with people I've talked to who are in the research business, more and more of them say that they really want to create a Gundam, which is kind of a
Right.
scary thought.
Right.
This is
Right.
just a couple of years ago in Tokyo. But I love to see how every year it gets smaller and more advanced and more agile, and it starts to look more and more like Tetsuo Atomo or Astro Boy. I wanted to mention, I just touched on it earlier, my new book, which is coming out just in a week or two. It's on a Buddhist sutra called the Heart Sutra, which normally would have nothing to do with robots, but somehow I had to put in something about robots because there's this fabulous android robot that's been created in Kyoto. It was on display last year in a temple called Kodaiji. And what's extraordinary about this robot is that it's actually an android robot. It doesn't walk. It doesn't. Actually, the fingers are you can't manipulate the fingers the way that Asimo can. But this is a consecrated robot. In other words, people actually go to worship this robot, and it will give a sermon about the Heart Sutra to the people who come to the temple to visit it. So people would actually come up and pray to it. And I just thought, well, this is totally interesting. And actually, there was a article in the local newspaper in Japan, and they had an interview with one of the, I think he's either the abbot or one of the movers and shakers in the temple organization, and he talked about how they have a lot of visitors from all over Japan and also from China and the United States before the pandemic, and he said a lot of them and especially from the West, had a hard time understanding this because they associated it with Frankenstein. And there is this long tradition in the United States before Japanese robots became popular of people thinking of robots as these perhaps threatening entities, Frankenstein kind of creatures who would, take over the world and get rid of the humans. But he said in Japan, there's no problem at all because everybody's been raised on Mighty Atom or Astro Boy and Gigantor and that sort of thing. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. So even though in the United States and in Europe, people have almost totally absorbed the Japanese aesthetic of toy robots and in animation and whatnot, there's still a little bit of a resistance, I guess, among some people who came. So it's sort of logical that we would find a robot at a temple in Japan that's consecrated and is worshipped as well. And I think also it's interesting because when I reflect on it, robots, of course, Japan actually became interested in robots just about the same time that the United States and Europe did. It started, the word robot comes from robota, which is a Czech word, and it was part of a playwright, a Czech playwright who created a play called RUR, or Rossum's Universal Robots in English. And that was written in 1920, and I think it was performed in the West in 1922, and by 1924 it was also performed in the Ginza area in Tokyo. And for the first several years in Japan, actually robots in general were referred to as Jinzo Ningen, or artificial humans. But then by the 30s, they had totally adopted the English word robot, or roboto. And of course now that is the word. Most young people don't think of Jinzo Ningen anymore at all. But again, I thought this was a really interesting example of how this, deep relationship or lack of fear of this technology would develop in Japan. And of course, Japan has taken, as Matt has mentioned and I've mentioned, it's taken this whole concept of robots in a very uniquely Japanese way, in a very different way. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. There's more and more talk about using robots, of course, for elderly care in Japan, which is a huge issue. So there are companies trying to develop, robots personal robots that can help on a variety of levels with people who have Alzheimer's or dementia, that sort of thing. So it'll be a very interesting sort of area to keep an eye on. I think we're almost over in terms of our time, aren't we?
Do we have time for one more segue? How are we looking time?
Oh, that's right. You have another segue. You have a whole other session. That's right. You're on.
Well, okay, I'm on. Okay, let's do that. I'm always on. I'm actually really glad you touched. I'm really glad you touched on that kind of spiritual aspect, because one of the things that's always sort of fascinated me is, well, why Japanese robots? Why is Japan so fascinated with robots? Why are their portrayals of robots so different from ours? And after doing a lot of thinking about this and talking about it with Hiroko, my wife, who is Japanese and who I've collaborated on a lot of different books with, I came to realize that it's actually sort of the manifestation of some very sort of uniquely Japanese worldviews and mindsets. And I'll just quickly, before we get back into the fun stuff and the toys, I wanted to quickly take a look at this, which is that Japan, as you may or may not know, has a very long tradition of polytheism and animism. According to Japanese Shinto lore, Japan is home to some 8 million gods, which is not intended as a specific number, but just a kind of uncountable multitude. And these gods take all sorts of forms, from kind of world-creating almighty deities all the way down to gods of the toilet, like literal sentient forces that inhabit the world around us. Shinto religion is very much about worshiping the terrain and the idea that spirits are in the world all around us. And this manifests even in modern times. If you go to certain shrines, you'll see monuments to inanimate objects that have helped us throughout our lives. This photograph I took at the bottom was taken in Ueno Park, and it is a shrine, a monument to eyeglasses for helping us see better. And there are monuments to things like knives and needles and all sorts of tools that we use to make our lives better. And this manifests in a form of Japanese creature slash character known as the yokai, many of which are anthropomorphic tools that have faithfully served humans and kind of taken on sentient form because of their long association with us. This is a scroll from the 1500s up top of yokai parading, and you can see a yokai umbrella. You can see yokai sandals. There is a yokai, what appears to be a walking stick, and all sorts of other kind of this multitude of creatures out there. And one of the really interesting things about yokai is that they are shapeshifters. Yokai are also known as obake in Japan, or bakemono, and that literally means something transformed, something changed. So it's interesting when you think about this. You know, Japan did not invent the concept of robots. Japan didn't make the world's first cars or planes or anything like that. But yet Japan was the first country to come up with the idea of a car that transforms into a robot, or more accurately, it is a robot that is disguising itself as a car or an airplane in the world around us. It is a shapeshifter. So to me, things like the Transformers are very much modern day manifestations of yokai. They are personifications of technology that we can literally get into and ride into, which is thanks in a very large part to Go Nagai and Mazinger, which was the very first robot that people could kind of climb into and get into and become one with. And I think it's very telling. Majing, is a word written that sounds very yokai-like in Japanese. It's written with the word for kind of darkness, like for dark magic or things like that, and for person. So it's this kind of supernatural manifestation. The word that he picked is something that sounds very traditional for the name of Mazinger. It doesn't sound high-tech at all. It's basically a throwback to this era of all sorts of creatures, that these yokai creatures that were once believed to dwell in the world all around us. Some of them humanoid, some of them animal, and some of them literal, physical, inanimate, man-made objects taken uncanny sentient form. So you have this kind of interesting worldview in which, you know, an animated inanimate object isn't necessarily Frankensteinian. It isn't necessarily a terrifying presence. It can actually be a sort of mascot or a pal. And I think this is also what fuels something else that we very much associate with Japan today, which is its, I'm going to share the screen again here, its mascot culture. So many of which take the form of these anthropomorphic representations of all sorts of things in the world around us. And some of them are literal mascots. Up at the left is like the police department's mascot. But look right underneath that, this personification of a tsunami that is being used. And look at the buildings, the terrified buildings. And this is being used. This isn't some kind of joke. This isn't some kind of play on words or anything. This is a poster to get citizens to participate in tsunami drills, which are a very real problem. As we all know in Japan from the horrific losses of the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. And the fact that imagery like this is being used is in one sense a form of outreach to kind of soften this a little bit and get people to pay attention, but it's also an idea of these kind of forces that might exist in the world around us. And that, you know, are kind of beyond human control. And I think that very much underlies a lot of the idea of these titanic, powerful mechanical robot presences, because what better way to personify technology than a robot, a humanoid piece of technology? It's literally a machine that looks like we do. It is very much in the vein of these anthropomorphic animistic presences that have dwelled in the Japanese conscious and subconscious since as long as there has been a Japan. So I think it's really key to understand that sort of history, to also understand why people all over the world find characters like Mazinger Z, like Gundam, like Evangelion, who, again, Evangelion is a throwback to this. He looks like an Oni, a Japanese traditional demon, and is described as such in the design documents for him. Why these characters resonate so much with people all over the world, and apparently with the accounting departments of Japanese companies, as we saw in Dream Project, where Mazinger Z is being used to kind of revitalize this moribund department in a big company to kind of infuse new life into it. So, you know, it's robots. To me, the power of Japanese robots is something very, very real and very visceral that goes beyond fantasy, or maybe a testament to the way fantasy can transform reality. So I don't know if we're on topic or on time anymore, but that's basically wraps it up for my part of this presentation.
I think that's probably a great place to end it, Shun.
How are we doing time-wise, Shun?
Any words of wisdom?
All right, we're back. I'd like to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their wisdom with us, and Matt for sharing your extensive robot collection. Now I'd like to open this up for questions received from the audience. For this segment, I'd like to welcome Professor Smith, who will be moderating the Q&A session. So Professor Smith, please take it away. I will see you all at the very end shortly.
Hi, thank you very much. So I have some of your questions on YouTube, on the live chat there. And I also have some questions that were pre-posted in Eventbrite. So please go ahead and continue to post your questions for our speakers. And I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we'll do what we can. So the first question I have, I was told I must ask this, is Matt, you have a story about that giant Mazinger Z we saw in the video. Can you give us that story?
Yeah, so that's actually a store display. That's it was used in toy stores in the 1970s to sell Mazinger products, and they're very rare these days. They're tough to come by. And I got a call from a friend of mine who saw one on the street outside of a lingerie shop wearing a bra that was being used by its owner to advertise her wares. And I actually, you know, when I heard about this, I just wanted to go see it. And because I'd never actually seen one in person before, wearing a bra or otherwise. And I spoke to the owner and I was like, you know, dress Mazinger however you want. No, you know, no shame in whatever your thing is, but please don't leave it out in the sun and the rain. This is really rare. Like, this is a really rare piece of history. And it started this conversation, and eventually she said, you know, I want you to have this, and we negotiated it, and I obtained it. But it is the only toy in my collection that was originally purchased wearing women's clothing. So
that's great. I'm glad you rescued it and gave it a good home. So we got a couple questions here about that I think were pretty well answered in the presentation about, you know, Shinto practice leading to Japanese acceptance of robots and so on and so forth. But one person asked, and maybe I'll direct this at Fred, since you had that wonderful picture of the sacred robot. One person asked, is there anything culturally sacred that robots would never be considered for? So obviously prayers are on the table, but is there anything that is off the table?
You know, I can't think of anything specific. Maybe Matt can, but I think that there is less resistance in Japan to the idea of robots in general, not just fantasy robots, but real robots. But we have to be really careful when we talk about whether people have resistance or not, because in Japan, I think Matt would probably agree with me, but there is this sort of, you can develop all kinds of theories for why robots are popular, but if you really dig deep and you analyze them, they're often not as simple as they seem. And I think in some ways, well, I've actually heard people in Japan, a couple of people express the theory that robots were welcomed in the initial stages with when you're talking about industrial robots, they were welcomed more easily into Japan, not only because of animism, but also because of most people in Japan are either Buddhists or Shinto believers, and in the United States and North America and Western Europe, on the contrary, you have there's all kinds of biblical associations with not golems, but people are afraid of recreating man and carrying out something that God should normally be doing, that it would be almost against the will of God or blasphemous to create an image. So there are kind of religious aspects, but I think also in Japan, many corporations were really clever to use this lack of resistance to robots and wrap it in an ideology. So there's an ideology in Japan that robots are friendly, and part of this is from anime, and part of this is from manga. People are raised with it now. There's this attitude that robots can help us in all kinds of ways that probably in the West, many people would say, well, wait a moment, that sounds sort of like Frankenstein. That's kind of creepy. I don't know if I really want a robot, doing this and that. So there's it's really complicated, because if you start talking too much about animism and too much about, religion and so forth and so on, then you get into the world of kind of mumbo jumbo, and it's like, what are we talking about here? And we mentioned earlier before we came on, but you can look in the West where people christen battleships before they go out to sea. So there's a religious component to that as well. So it's just very complicated. And I also think there's one other element that, this is just my own personal opinion, but actually some Japanese scholars I think may have mentioned this too, but in the West, people were kind of guinea pigs for the Industrial Revolution. In Japan, they had an advantage. They're a disadvantage in the sense that they were late to the Industrial Revolution, but the advantage is that the people were not turned into guinea pigs quite the way they were in the West. So there are not as many, I think, sort of residual painful memories about new technology. Although some people would say, well, what about the A-bomb in Japan? People remember that, and they shouldn't be afraid of technology. And that may be true, but there are also people who in Japan have said that, one of the reasons that Japan lost the war in World War II was because they weren't advanced enough in technology. And actually the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, expressed this thought. So it's a very complicated situation, and I don't want to go on too much here, but I just trying to, just show that it's a little bit bigger than just saying, well, Japanese love robots and Westerners don't. It's actually, there's a lot of complicated factors in there.
Yeah, thank you. Matt, did you have anything to add, or?
No, I just, I think that's actually that's really on point, how, Japan was so desperate to catch up with the West in the 19th century, the late 19th century, and during the war, that I think the just entire fundamental attitude towards technology is just completely different in Japan than you see in the West. And I hadn't actually thought about the Industrial Revolution and the guinea pigs aspect before. That's a really, I think, interesting way of looking at it. But it's great stuff.
Okay. Maybe that leads. I'll let you guys decide if it leads into this next question. But several people asked. So I'll just kind of paraphrase several questions. But people wondered why it seems that robots are not as popular or as common in anime as they used to be, or hit properties. So maybe you could comment on, first of all, is there a decline, and if there is, why? And I'll ask for
there isn't. There's still definitely robot shows being made. Absolutely. Gundam continues. Evangelion continues. But it is a fact that the kind of mainstream of Japanese anime is no longer rooted so much in the kind of fantastic science fiction that it was in the 70s and 80s. One reason for that, societally speaking, might be that when Mazinger Z was made, when Gundam was made, when the kind of golden age of robot shows were being made, was during Japan's meteoric rise as an economic superpower. Japan had become the second largest economy on the planet right before Mazinger Z aired. And a lot of the shows we consider classic were made during what's known as the bubble era, which is when Japan was so powerful economically that other nations around the world actually actively feared that Japan would take over the world economically. That all crashed to a halt in 1990 with the bursting of the bubble. and it ushered in this period known as the Lost Decades. And during the Lost Decades, all of the things Japanese had taken for granted, like lifetime employment and all sorts of things like this, all the social contracts that they'd expected, all of it crumbled. Young people's dreams crumbled. And a lot of social problems began manifesting their head, kind of rearing their heads. And things like, for instance, hikikomori, which is a word we use now, people who don't come out of their homes, or parasite singles, who are people who just refuse to start their own family and just would rather live at their parents' home because it's easier, things like this. Otaku is a word that originated in the 80s, but it's people who just define themselves through hyperconsumption of pop culture stuff. And I think what happened is that the dreams of Japanese people kind of came down to earth, especially young people around that period. Gundam is about colonizing space. Mazinger Z is about becoming an invincible warrior for justice. The modern kind of post-2000 shows are what is known as moe, which is a kind of fascination with adolescence and youth, often set in high schools. And so a kind of cynical view would be that, oh, wow, like dreams have gotten so small, they're limited to the schoolyard now, which is a little bit too cynical, I think, of looking at it. But it is a fact that the shows we see now tend not to focus on gigantic mechanical heroes so much as young people thrown into extraordinary situations, whether it's something like Your Name, which is this kind of time-slipping, gender-bending thing, or the current absolutely hugely popular anime in Japan right now, Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, which is, again, young people kind of questing through this world of Oni, demons that they have to kind of release Japan from. So yeah, times have changed. Society has changed. And that's why I think we're seeing less robot fare in the mainstream. It's still absolutely there in the subculture otaku sphere, very much less so in the mainstream sphere.
Fred, how about you?
I could add to that. I think that there's often a cycle on these things, and I think Matt would probably agree, but there have probably been people who have prophesized the end of the robot genre anime and manga many times over, and then some artists will come up with some great new concept, or just repackage it. And I haven't given up on robots in Japan. I think, somebody's probably working in his studio and trying to come up with some idea. I don't know if it's a drivable robot or something just totally different, and it'll probably catch on. Maybe it'll be a cute robot because it's not just mechanical giant warrior robots, cute, adorable robots too. And it's easy to imagine somebody coming up with another kind of version of Doraemon or robot furry cat in your life or something like that. I mean, I think it's kind of.
I think just the type of escape that people demand has changed. And it's also been hugely inflected by video games, which is why you see right now there's a huge trend for a new genre of entertainment called isekai, which is another world, which is you find yourself as an avatar in a totally different place. And in the past, you were an avatar in like a giant robot or something like that in our world. Now people are looking to get out of our world. Everybody's experiencing lost decades now, especially in the pandemic era. And I just think, what each generation sees as its escape is different. I mean, the things that the 60s love, the hippie flower children saw as an escape are very different from what 70s, 80s, 90s today saw. So that dreams change. And right now they're not so robot oriented, but as Fred said, that doesn't mean don't count a robot out. There's always room for robots.
I'm sure there'll be a really cute one that'll be popular in the next few years.
Yeah, I think someone on the live chat was just saying we need moe bots, and that'll be the final configuration. Do you think there's a sort of correlation maybe between like now that Japan is offshoring so much manufacturing, like now people will just encounter industrial robots far less? Is there a connection there with having fewer robot anime?
I don't know if there's a connection to robot anime, but I can say that, in the very beginning when industrial robots were introduced, and we often had Shinto priests verify the robot and dedicate it and whatnot. But there's so many robots now, obviously they can't do that. The corporations do their best still to wrap it in a familiar, friendly kind of aura, but I think that part of this over. And also so many industrial robots have moved out of Japan because there's so much manufacturing that's been offshore and sent either, industrial robots are ubiquitous. Matt?
Well, I think right now you can say the most widespread industrial robot out there is the drone, the military drone. And, in the West, robot research is driven so much by military needs. The Roomba came out of a military project. I believe it's using a mine sweeping algorithm.
I have one.
That has been, but that wouldn't exist without war. You know what I mean? Boston Dynamics, they are making machines. They show videos of, helping people in factories and stuff, but the number one consumer of these sorts of things is the military. Japan does not have that ability to pour money into projects that the West does, that the Western governments and Western military contractors do. So because Japan's economy has sort of plateaued and stagnated, you don't see the amount of money being poured into these pie in the sky projects that you used to back in the 80s, that gave us things like Honda's Asimo, which as much as I love Asimo, has been completely lapped by Boston Dynamics and other companies, foreign bipedal robots these days. But I don't think that means that robots occupy any less of a position in the Japanese fantasy sphere, so to speak. People love robots here. There's still tons of robot toys on the shelves. There's still a lot of robot anime being produced, and there's still, I've got them on my desk. They're here. They're here with us at all times. So it's it's tempting to look at these as kind of a zero sum game. Oh, well, like schoolgirls are in, robots are out, but it's much more of a balanced sort of thing than that, I think.
Yeah. I guess there's two things I would add to that. And one is that when it comes to developing robots, like in the lab, Japan actually has invested a lot of money in developing humanoid robots, much more than in the United States until recently. And just to show how complicated it is, one of the most interesting robots and the most advanced humanoid robots was the shaft robot, which was developed in Japan, in Tokyo. I believe a group from the University of Tokyo started it. And the shaft robot was eventually acquired by Google. And then Google had a very large, robotics development program going on in the United States. And I guess maybe the people who started it were fans of robot animation and manga. I don't know, or toys or whatever. But then I guess Google came to the conclusion that, there wasn't any money in this business. So they got rid of it. And then the shaft was reacquired by SoftBank. And then SoftBank let it die. So it's all a very complicated scenario when we start talking about different cultures.
Was Shaft named after the company in pot labor? There's like a robot production company in the anime pot labor named Shaft.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I could be wrong. It's kind of
sure. This is Japan. This is Japan, so I would not put it past anybody.
And just one other thing I wanted to add was that when people talk about robots, we have to be really careful, because what people in Japan refer to when they're talking about robots and what people are often talking about in the West are often quite different. So we're actually surrounded by robots in the United States and in Japan. And a lot of people don't think of things that are robots that really are. Your ATM machine is a kind of a robot. It doesn't necessarily have to look like a human. In Japan, they're much more inclined to label a thing a robot, even if it doesn't necessarily look like a human or a cute robot or a giant warrior robot. And that's a big difference in the United States. We tend to be much more practical in the way we label things. And that's also been a huge issue in the world of industrial robots, because the definition of a robot is very is pliable. It fluctuates a lot depending on what culture you're in.
Okay. I know we might be running out of time, but one interesting question that came up was that someone mentioned that mecha is sort of traditionally in Japan a kind of boys genre, and they wanted to know, and for either of you, I guess, how do you view the prospects for sort of greater gender representation in mecha anime? And then kind of simultaneously, other people mentioned how much they enjoyed Battle Angel Alita, I guess the the live action version produced in Hollywood, which I believe started off as a seinen manga, but it kind of in the Hollywood version has a much more sort of focus on the main character. So I'll open that up, see what you guys think.
Well, just real quick, I don't think that the fan base for the most recent spate of Gundam anime is men. I think it's women. I think women are there was actually a little survey done a couple of years back by an anime magazine that asked men and women what their favorite shows were. And in the past, anime, as with almost any genre of show, would cast the lead as who they imagined the demographic to be. The demographic for Mazinger Z was young boys, so they put a young man as the pilot. But that has sort of flipped in the post-2000s period, where in this survey, the majority, 80% of men surveyed were all watching shows about high school girls. And the majority of women were watching shows about robots like Mazinger Z, like Gundam Unicorn and things like that, like the most recent Macross, which is the what Japanese call what was called Robotech in the United States. The more recent Macross series in Japan have all been supported heavily by female fans. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about women and anime, it's a much more nuanced thing than isn't a woman in starring in the series or is a woman creating the series. You have to look at demographics, consumption patterns, and things like that. So yes, there's a lot of potential for crossovers, demographic crossovers of all sorts with mecha is like robots are like a filter that you can apply to almost any genre and come up with something fun and new. So that's my feeling on it. Fred?
I think that the concept of mecha is, this goes beyond robots, of course, but in the fantasy world in Japan, I really became aware of the word in Japan with actually the manga and later the animated films of Leiji Matsumoto, or Matsumoto Leiji. He really sort of developed this idea of he was obsessed with drawing machines, and he was able to draw machines and military weapons and everything in a very just romantic way. He was able to romanticize the concept of the machine. But if you look at mecha, there's usually, I think, and Matt, I think you'd probably agree, but there's usually some element in even the giant warrior genre where there's some kind of mecha or robot character or something that appeals to the female audience. And of course, if you stretch the definition of mecha, if you're just going to talk about robots, then a huge number of young, I shouldn't say young women, girls were attracted to Uran in the Astro Boy series, sure. Uran being Astro Boy's sister. And then if you blur the definition of mecha a little bit more, and if you include things like Doraemon or Arare-chan, there's just a huge number of female fans of those things. So I guess I would agree with Matt. It's a little more complicated than it might seem on the surface.
Well, Japanese pop culture has always been about blurring all sorts of lines between young and old, between male and female, between straight and gay. These categories that humans have arbitrarily placed on their societies and their interactions. Manga and anime have traditionally been a kind of sandbox where creators can kind of get around those things and really start to play with these fundamental ideas. And that's why there's huge, in Japan, there's shonen manga for boys and shoujo manga for girls. And as Fred knows very, very well, because he wrote about this extremely eloquently in Manga, there are huge fan bases among men, even grown men, for shoujo girls manga. And there's huge fan bases of women, everybody from girls to adults, for manga that are aimed at boys. And, actually, again, even though it has nothing to do with mecha, Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, is a shonen manga for boys, but it's drawn by a woman. And it has a very feminine sort of taste to it, a sensibility to it. So, I think these ideas of boundaries and categories have always been outdated to a certain degree. And the way that Japanese creators have played with that is why Japanese pop culture, why anime, why manga has become not only a hit, but a sort of identity for people all over the world.
And I think it's one of the fascinating things about Japanese pop culture, because everything is sort of boxed initially for one or the other genre or gender, I should say. Like the level of the gender stratification and the categorization in manga magazines is just hard to believe. But nonetheless, there's this total anarchy in readership, like Matt said. The girls are reading, giant warrior robot stories, and the young boys are reading some, story that was written for 10-year-old girls. And adults reading stories written for 10-year-old girls. It's just total anarchy. And maybe that's one of the appeals of Japanese pop culture.
I think so.
Do we have time for one more very quick question?
Sure.
Okay. This is maybe just real quick from each of you. Is there a robot franchise from Japan that hasn't taken off internationally, but you feel should be getting more attention?
I'll refer to you on that one.
Well, there's just so many robot shows in Japan. Many of them have not really made it abroad. Like, we only tend to get, or traditionally have only tended to get the real, like the peaks, the big hits from Japan, like Evangelion or like Gundam, but neither one of those would exist without a show called Ideon that came out a couple of years before Gundam. It's directed by Tomino, who later directed Gundam, and deals with many of the themes that Gundam and Evangelion later take up in a much more pinpoint sort of way. It's a great series. It's really amazingly animated. It has a great cast of characters, and maybe it's available in English now, but it certainly wasn't broadcast. It certainly wasn't a hit. But Ideon is a kind of touchstone for mecha fans in Japan, and it's one that I definitely think, if you like giant robots, you should try to seek it out, because it really paved the way for the grown-upification, I just made up that word, of dealing with mature themes in what was supposed to be a totally disposable genre of kids fluff. And before creators like Tomino decided to make an artistic expression out of it.
I can just add to that. I think in terms of exporting genres from Japan, even though the Gundam series is quite well known among American otaku and fans of Japanese animation and manga, it's never really gone mainstream in the United States. And I think one of the main reasons is that, and I think there's probably rights issues. It's just complicated dealing with all the rights holders, but I have always expected a major American studio to do a really good CGI, or not a CGI version, but a version using a lot of great CGI with top, American actors and whatnot. And I think that would really be fascinating for some studio in Hollywood to do. And they could do a better job of it probably than any studio in Japan could. And it's always been a mystery to me that hasn't happened yet, because Gundam, I think, there's so much Gundam material, and there's so many wonderful stories, including the original stories, that would work really well today because of the advances that have been made in CGI that were preventing a really high quality movie being made in Hollywood before. All the tools are available now, and it's always a mystery to me that it hasn't been done. And I think it will be soon. Somebody will clear all the hurdles that are, I'm sure, in the way.
Pacific Rim kind of cleared the way.
Yeah, but it didn't do very well.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? That's the thing. Gundam to me is a really fascinating series, because as I talk about in my recent book, Pure Invention, it's kind of a story of war that can only be written by somebody from the losing side. The protagonist is very reluctant. And we don't have a lot of characters like that in the West, where like Amuro, who's the star of Gundam, really does not want to be a pilot of Gundam. He doesn't want to be involved in this war at all, and is constantly at every turn resisting, to the point where he actually runs away for a big part of the first series, and they have to track him down. And it's like, to Westerners, it's like, you have this giant robot. Why aren't you having a great time smashing stuff? And that's, I think right there, the schism between the way Japanese are approaching this art form, where, they have the experience of young people being drafted into battle and basically thrown into the meat grinder, that we have much less of an experience of. in the West. Of course, there was a draft during Vietnam and all of that, but it was much smaller scale than what Japan was going through during World War II. So it's yeah, I mean, just I think that more than anything is really what's holding it back. Thematically, I think Gundam is very difficult to tackle for Western creatives and filmmakers, just because it comes from such a different place.
Yeah, yeah. I was just going to say one thing that in terms of the complexity of, the nomenclature of everything. One thing that I always find kind of funny is that people talk about, giant warrior robots and Gundam and so forth and so on. And actually, most of them are not robots at all. They're drivable, so they're not autonomous and they don't think on themselves. You have to have a human in there, and that's what sells the toys. Tezuka actually used to refer to, the giant warrior genre as mainly being what he called power shovels. In other words, giant, so like steam shovels, because he wanted, of course, to promote, Astro Boy, which was a true autonomous robot, could function just like a human. So there's all these interesting elements, and we could talk forever. I think about.
Yes, we could. we should start a podcast. We should just start doing this regularly.
And I wanted to mention, actually, Matt, and just between you and me, nobody else needs to know this stuff, but actually there were drivable robots in an Astro Boy series or Tetsuo Anton series in the 1950s. It was called Mars Expedition to Mars, I think.
Oh, wow.
Kaseikan Gentai. And there were drivable robots in that. So, it's all very complicated.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Also, he had that character Garon, Machine Garon,
right, yeah,
which is the big green guy as a kid piloting him. I think that's sort of a sentient half alien. So, Tezuka was, of course, the amazing pioneer for this kind of thing. And there were actually other pilotable robot things even before Mazinger came out.
Yeah.
Like none of them took off. Yeah. Literally and figuratively. So it's just, basically Mazinger Z was the Pokemon of its era.
Yeah.
We look at it back now fondly, nostalgically, but it was a Pokemon style boom that really consumed Japan. And it's, nobody knows what's going to trigger those kinds of things.
And all I can say in conclusion is that, I'd love to have a giant warrior robot that I could drive. It would be cool.
That's why I started learning. I literally started learning Japanese because I figured that by the time I learned it, that would be a job description. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened, so I had to become a writer. But
it would create a lot more demand for infrastructure investment in Japan and the United States.
Well, I still think it's like there's a series called G Fighter Gundam where the world all solves its problems by not fighting wars but sending Gundams to fight each other in a kind of arena. I still think this is the future. I think we should be considering this at the UN.
Yeah.
So is that it for us? Can I? Are more questions? Are we going to wrap this up? How do you want to handle this?
Well, there are more questions, but is that up for time? Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like we are out of time. I think actually we are almost 15 minutes over time. So. Oh, wow. I think that's it. Thank you both so much for giving us your great stories and entertaining so many questions. And I think we'll have to stop there.
This is great. I think we could go on and on and on and on. It's fun.
Yes, we could. And if I might say
to the podcast.
Yes, definitely. And if everybody I hate to just be a PR flag here, but if you enjoyed this, I have a new book out called Pure Invention: How Japan's Pop Culture Conquered the World. And I talk about many of these things. Oh, it disappeared. Gundam, and all sorts of stuff in this book. So if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to know more about the kind of socio-political background of this, by all means, check out your local bookseller. Thanks.
It's great. I already got my copy and I read it.
Thank you. Thank you. So that's an honor. That is really, I wrote it for you. Really.
Well, thank you.
In a lot of ways.
All my books were for you, Matt.
That's an honor too.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I know that we want to keep going with this talk, which is great, and I know a lot of reviewers are excited, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for tonight. But I'd like to give a big thank you to our wonderful guests and moderator for their expertise in making this event possible. So our film festival will continue until next Sunday, the 13th, and there will be another virtual lecture, this time focusing on images of nature, which is scheduled for next Wednesday, the 9th. Also, the Morikami Museum and Japanese Gardens were kind enough to share some family-friendly activities that you can try at home with your kids. And I've included the registration and the links for the activities in the description box as well. So please make sure to check that as well. Until then, we hope you will continue to enjoy the films, and we will look forward to seeing you again at our next virtual event. So take care, stay safe, and have a great night.